We started off the programme tonight with Mr. Phil Lynott, and there was a good reason for that. One of them, well, many reasons for that, I suppose, but one of the good reasons is that I always liked Phil Lynott and Thin Lizzy. Always saw them as the group that made it easier for the likes of U2 and the Sinead O'Connors and the Cranberries, kind of set the pavement, if you like, for other groups to transition out of Ireland and make it big worldwide. And Phil Lynott himself, such a great person and talented musician. Well, there's a fabulous book out at the moment, and it's published by a man who doesn't live far from the city centre. He lived in he hails from Carrigaline originally. His name is Alan Byrne, but more about Alan in a minute. But the book called Phil Lynott, Renegade of Thin Lizzy is in shops at the moment, and I got to read some of the book during the week, and like I say, it is a fabulous read. It gives you great insight into Phil Lynott, the person. And we'll be talking in just a few seconds to Alan Byrne. But first of all, let me tell you a little bit about Alan. He's researched and writing about the careers of Thin Lizzy and Phil Lynott since 1998. So that makes him a well-established expert and somewhat of an authority when it comes to Phil Lynott and Thin Lizzy. He's also produced radio documentaries on various aspects of Phil Lynott's career and has contributed to classic rock and a variety of other publications. He's also working on his first novel, and we'll find out some of that as well. Because on the line, as we should speak in the magic of radio and technology, is the same said Alan Byrne. Alan, good evening.
Hello, Donald. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, sir. During the week, you sent me down a copy of your book, Phil Lynott, Renegade of Thin Lizzy, and I must say it is absolutely fabulous. It is, it's a great insight into the man himself. I said in my introduction to you that you've been involved in some way with Thin Lizzy as regards writing about them and their careers since 1999, beg your pardon. Sure. That is certainly, must have been, what was it about Thin Lizzy, I suppose, that kind of captured you?
I suppose to begin with, it really started off just writing articles. At the time, it wasn't, shall we say, it wasn't all that, you know the way older bands, they come back and they have their time again, that kind of way. So it actually just began really with just writing up articles, articles from my local newspaper in Carrigaline.
Right.
And so essentially it just kind of, really the ball started rolling from there. But in terms of, before that, the likes of Thin Lizzy or, you know, the Dubliners or all that kind of music was regularly played in my house when I was growing up. So that's kind of where it started.
I must say the book gives a great insight into the life of Phil Lynott, the personal life of Phil Lynott, and it had its challenges for Phil Lynott. I suppose the first challenge that the guy faced, he was very young at the time when he moved from London over to Dublin. Perhaps you could take up the story for us there, Alan.
Sure, yeah, because essentially, there's actually quite a lot of stories about Phil when he came over from England. But a lot of people, for some reason, think he was actually born in Dublin, but he was actually born in England, around the Birmingham area. But obviously, his mum was Irish, and but he essentially, when things had got to a certain point for her, Philomena, in terms of being able to cope, she decided to essentially call her mum and dad, and they took him in and raised him. So he, I suppose, in effect, was raised in an environment that she herself was raised in. So it certainly was an interesting kind of maybe an alternative upbringing. Certainly back in that time, which would have been the early 50s.
Do you think that affected him? It must have affected him through the remainder of his life. Do you think, the fact that his own biological mom really couldn't, for whatever reasons, support him and made a sound decision for him, I suppose, in sending him over to her own parents, his grandparents. But do you think that had a major effect on Lynott during the rest of his life?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a point that's I've touched on that during, in the book. Certainly, there are a couple of comments from particularly the post Thin Lizzy era, which would would have been the kind of 1984, 85. And he, after Thin Lizzy broke up, he went on to form Grand Slam. And there's a couple of lads who comment about his very iffy, I think that's to use the quote, very iffy outlook, particularly with women.
Yeah, there's a line on the book here I just want to say on page 31, and it says, Phil was screwed up completely. He had a chip on his shoulder about being black in Ireland and not knowing who his father was.
Yeah, well, and just as quickly, that's, I think, a quote from the keyboard player, or the initial keyboard player, Eric Rickson.
That's right, yeah.
From the initial lineup of Thin Lizzy as a four-piece. Essentially, there's also people who counteract that comment, which I think is, as you go on in the text, and that explains, I think Jim Fitzpatrick, the man responsible for the cover of the new book, and obviously all the Thin Lizzy album sleeves and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And he's quoted across the years as saying, as quoting Phil, saying that, being black in Dublin in the 1950s was no different to having cauliflower ears,
Right,
so
yeah.
There's stories that counteract these kind of comments as well.
And let's talk about, I suppose, the entry into Phil into his music career and stuff. He played in Sinnott's Bar, which was upstairs, more for reciting poetry than anything else. But Phil could often be seen there or take part there in his younger day.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's actually something that came as not quite a surprise, but to get a little bit of an insight into it, in that he was frequenting that type of scene. And he was obviously, as a teenager, he was always writing in his notebooks and, lyric ideas that essentially, there were some lyrics that surfaced in the early 80s that he had initially written in the late 60s.
Right.
So he was constantly going back. And a lot of those ideas came from visiting the likes of Sinnott's and going to these spoken word kind of evenings, that kind of way.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of different kind of influences that he was taking on board at that time, and even at that time when he was going into Sinnott's, he was a teenager, and he wasn't playing bass guitar or anything like that. He was a singer.
Yeah.
So it was prior to what later became that image, I suppose, that he kind of made for himself.
Right, and then he went on to numerous different bands around Dublin, playing gigs around Dublin, paying gigs, but on most of them he was playing guitar more than singing, was he?
Well, initially no. He was, I think Brian Downey, the Thin Lizzy drummer, he was saying actually one of the first times that he saw him. He was a frontman. He was just singing. He wasn't playing any instrument. But what he did have was had this. If I suppose think of Michael Jackson back in the day when he had that shiny glove,
right?
And that's what Phil had. And
I'm just thinking. Sorry for interrupting you, Alan.
Sure.
That a lot of the Lizzy connoisseurs out there, if you can call them that, there's a shiver gone up their backs now when you mention Jackson and Lynott in the same sentence. Sorry about that, but go ahead.
But it's that type of thing, It was that imagery, I suppose, that kind of way. He was very much so into fashion, that kind of way.
Right.
And even if, particularly the early Lizzy stuff, which I love, the Eric Bell era, shall we say, of Whiskey in the Jar and the Rocker and all that kind of thing. There's a very, not particularly a hippie aspect, but there was a very folky kind of aspect, which came from the image as well that he was kind of propelling, I suppose.
Right. And he also kind of he went on, I suppose, during his time he was kind of known as somewhat of a ladies' man, or at least the ladies really admired him. How did that affect affect him? Because there was one case where he met up with a girl. Is it Carol was her name? Not sure of her surname in the book, but and they had a child, but that information wasn't revealed until 2003. Was that the case?
Yeah, that Dara would have been the child, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he did, again, that's going back to his teenage years.
Right.
And, the child was given up for adoption, and he's since been Dara Lamb is that man's name.
Right.
He has since, he's been acknowledged in that. I mean, if you look at him, you can see straight away because he's
the resemblance.
The bulb, as the man says.
Right, yeah. And Phil Lynott then, I suppose, just kind of to move it along a bit, went in, formed obviously Tin Lizzy. There was Gary Moore. I read that. I thought that was great about Gary Moore coming down from Belfast, and they had to ask Gary Moore's dad and stuff like that. Just give us a little bit of the story around that particular part of the book.
That actually came from Tim Booth, who is the artist who actually designed the original Tin Lizzy logo. Jim Fitzpatrick later updated it, and with Tim's permission and everything like that. But essentially, what had happened was that Tim Booth would have been maybe 7 or 8 years older, I suppose, certainly than Phil. And so essentially they were like an older brother type of relationship. And what had happened was that Gary Moore was after coming down from the north, essentially. And I think Brooke Shields was down in one club and Gary was playing in another. And they'd seen Gary and they'd tried to kind of get him into their group. There was a lot of poaching going on up in Dublin, actually, at that time.
Right.
From bands, And it was simply a case of that. Gary actually couldn't come down until Tim and the lads in Dublin kind of okayed it with his dad and that they'd keep an eye on him.
Yeah.
And at the time, like, he was only 16.
That's right, yeah.
So, I mean, that's, when you think of it, I mean, it's a very, very young age to make such a move.
Yeah, it is, but the book gets across the point as well, I think, how vibrant the live music scene was up in Dublin during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sounds like a fabulous time, that it was just hopping alive with venues for different local groups and rock groups and what have you to perform. Yeah. So they weren't starved for venues, that's for sure.
Absolutely not. And as you say that, I mean, they closed as fast as they opened, from what I'm after learning, that kind of way. Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's just typical of the time, I suppose.
Right.
But yeah, there was a great scene, and it wasn't just the music scene, as we were after talking earlier. There was the spoken word, there was the poetry nights, and there was also the art scene, which again Phil was very interested by, which is, I think, Jim Fitzpatrick, some of the quotes I'm after using there, he ties in quite a lot of, shall we say, what eventually became Tin Lizzy album covers later on.
Yes.
But they had their roots in the late 60s, when they first started to get to know each other.
Right. I just want to tell people you're listening to Cork City Community Radio on 100.5. The name of the programme is Your Call, and we're talking to Alan Byrne, who's the author of a great new book out at the moment, and it's called Phil Lynott, Renegade of Tin Lizzy. There's also some great pictures in the book of Phil Lynott back in his younger day with that big afro hairstyle that I suppose was in Ireland at the time. I'm just trying to picture this guy walking down O'Connell Street. Just a fabulous. That's what made him to a certain extent as well, wasn't it? When we talk about image and selling, it was his big afro hairstyle was fabulous.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually a few. There's a few stories I actually that didn't make the final kind of draft in the end, but there's a couple of lovely stories actually about when Tin Lizzy as a three-piece with Eric Bell, when they came down to Cork, and he'd walk up Patrick Street, and of course he'd stop traffic and buses. I mean, it's a bit of an urban legend at this point, but people do retell the story.
Yeah, that's
in much the same way. I mean, later on, I mean, if you take, I suppose, when he's, that it's a famous video now, but he didn't live long enough to, to see its impact when he's walking around Dublin in Old Town. And it's a very famous video now, but like I said, he didn't, shall we say, it didn't have the impact at the time when it was released in the early 80s.
And then, like with Tin Lizzy, and of course, a lot of us know the great group that they were and the great success that they had. But as all that was winding down, he felt immense pressure from the record company, didn't he? And he kind of knew that the time was coming, didn't he, really? Yeah,
there was, and that's how, actually, that's like the opening of the book, essentially. The introduction, as it were, essentially finds him at this point in his career when, in the early 80s, when the likes of Wham and Duran Duran and all those kind of bands were kind of taking over. He found it very difficult to compete with that.
Yeah.
And so it was a good, I thought, after a lot of chat between Una, who was the editor on the book, we were kind of looking for a good, opening chapter to, looking for maybe a piece of drama, but within the context of what was going on.
Right, yeah.
And that, it was a very tricky time for him. But having said that, there's a lot of good songs came out of that, and good songs, but not commercially successful songs.
Right, yeah. And then, of course, there was the whole tragedy for him when he got caught up in drugs and heroin and everything else. I suppose the pressures must have been huge at the time.
Yeah, it's not particularly a topic that you'd, when you're sitting down talking to somebody, I mean, it's not really, you see, it's already been so well documented that the way, like the approach I took was, well, Tin Lizzy released, 12 albums in a 13-year career. Yeah. So also had a couple of solo albums. So I thought, he was famous for being a writer. And that's the approach that
I know what you're saying, yeah. It wouldn't, it's, I suppose, well, you have to recognise the fact to a certain extent that, he got caught up in that trap, but the better part of his life kind of outshone all that crap, really, didn't it?
It did, yeah, and for the most part, you'll even see it or hear it in the documentaries with his friends, and they're kind of saying what he wanted to do was make an impact, and the way he would do that was through music. And I think it's the best way to go because it's been documented so often over the years. But what he was doing, everybody else was doing at that time. He happened to take it a step further, and it cost him,
Yeah. On my intro into Tin Lizzy, I was making the conclusion, I suppose, that they certainly made it an awful lot easier for groups like U2 and Sinead O'Connor and the Cranberries and, all the groups we have today to make that transition, because they were one of the first Irish groups, really, to make it across the water in England, which was huge for any Irish group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the interesting thing about that as well is that they didn't have any bar. There was nobody really to compare it to.
Yes.
Maybe perhaps Rory Gallagher, but I mean, he was essentially the same kind of generation as well. But they didn't really have anybody to measure up against. So they were, and that's, I think actually Tim Booth, in one of the quotes, describes him as a pioneer in that kind of, in that way. That's, in terms of innovation and what they had to do and how we saw the market and how we adjusted over the years.
Right. Do we have any insight into who would have been Phil Lynott's, when it comes to music, influence? Who would have influenced him? Now, I know that we discussed poetry earlier, and I suppose there could be a whole wide range of influences, but from that point of view, from an artistic point of view and a song and a playing point of view, who would have been his influences?
He was known to be obviously a big fan of Elvis Presley because of King's Call.
Yes.
And Hendrix obviously was also the guy at that time. Otis Redding is another guy.
Otis Redding, yeah.
Yeah, you'll actually see a lot of mannerisms. If you look at the older Otis Redding video shoots, now they're very basic. Shall we say they're prior to the conventional video promos. But you'll see a lot of actually the pointing of the finger and all that kind of thing. He took liberated, shall we say, quite a bit from a lot of the blues artists from America. And I'm not just talking about the 60s stuff. A lot of the kind of influence as well that Rory Gallagher would have taken, Robert Johnson and Blind Boy Fuller.
Right.
There's a lot of blues and soul in Thin Lizzy, but masked by frantic guitar playing. That kind of way.
Let me ask you, you've been in one way or another researching Thin Lizzy since 1998, and what would it the fact that might have surprised you the most that you've uncovered since then? Not necessarily about Phil Lynott, even though we're having the conversation, but about the band in general. Was there anything that kind of jumped out at you?
The bad luck they had, because the bad luck. I was talking to Jim Fitzpatrick a few months back, and it essentially had to do with, around the time that the Boys Are Back in Town was a big hit over in the States first, and then over this side of the ocean. Phil had got hepatitis, picked up hepatitis, and then later on the year, Brian Robertson had cut up his hand, and then they had to cancel tours and everything like that. An incredible amount of bad luck that they had over what essentially was a key period in their career, which would have been 1976 and 77. It's just, you couldn't write it. You couldn't make it up. Just how, at that key time in their career, that things just didn't pan out, and they never recovered that. They never kind of, number one, they didn't achieve it, but they also just, it's just an incredible string of bad luck.
Yeah. Well,
No, it's even later on then, and Gary Moore left them in the middle of a tour, 1979 in July, I think. So there was, just a constant string of bad luck, particularly in America, but they continued to sell tickets and albums over this side.
Right. Now, this book is how many other books have you written on this subject, on the band?
On Phil and Lizzy. My first book came out in 2004, and it was called Thin Lizzy, Soldiers of Fortune. That was done by an English publisher, and that did reasonably well. It came out as a hardback and then paperback, and there was a German translation actually as well, and so that it was reasonably well received. I was very happy with it, and there's been a few bits and pieces in between in terms of the UK music mags and the kind of radio stuff, all that.
And Renegade of Thin Lizzy, it's in the bookshops now.
Yeah, you'll find that in Eason's, Waterstones, and online as well. There's a website called irishbooksdirect.ie, and essentially they have it for sale as well.
Right, and it's definitely it's an absolutely fabulous book, a great read into a great guy, great talented musician, but it's a great insight into him and the amount of interviews. And how long did it take you to get all those interviews compiled and get this book out published? It must have taken forever, did it? Well,
I was actually looking back at old notes yesterday. The first notes, the idea, shall we say, the initial, how the chapters should be and what's going to be covered. September 2007 was when the initial, pen, paper, table, chair type of thing.
Right, sure.
And but there were gaps in between because I'm living in Cork, but a lot of sit down with people, which is the best way to do it, because I know a lot of people these days, enjoy Skyping and all that kind of thing, but there's nothing better than actually sitting down with somebody and, eyeball to eyeball, as it were. You get a much better impression of where you're looking to take the project.
Well, it's a fabulous book, and I think it'll do very well for you, because it's a great read. What's in the future for you? I read here in your press release that you're working on your first novel.
Yeah, in between, you see, when the contract for the Renegade with Lizzy came through last November, I think. You submit, and then you obviously get, there's kind of downtime, as it were, as it's, edits are being suggested, and as you go on. So, just basically to take up some time, I just said I'd give it a go, but, I'm not quite sure if it'll come to anything.
Right. Yeah.
But, I've just said it's a very different type of writing for me anyway.
Yeah.
Its preliminary title is File 21. Case File 21 is the name of it. Right. It's just a short story at this point, I think. Mm-hmm. Fiction, which isn't something I have done too much of before, so hopefully it'll work out.
Okay. Now, finally, I'm going to ask you. You were great in forwarding us some MP3s of work done by Phil Lynott, and the one that we're going to play in a few moments is One Wish. Can you tell us a little bit about the MP3s that you forwarded us, and what the hopes are for those eventually?
Sure. One of them, I think, is There's Always Someone Out to Get You. Yeah. That was the song, because I think I used some of the lyrics from that in the introduction, and it's a very, again, just to jump back, I suppose, to that kind of period of 1981-82 when Phil was on thin ice, as it were. It's a very telling lyric. Unfortunately, the song has never actually been released, and it's an absolutely superb song. And he had co-written it with a guitar player called Gus Isidore. Gus Isidore is the current guitar player for Seal, and has gone on to carve quite a career for himself. And he's a left-handed player in the kind of mold of Jimi Hendrix. And it's a very Hendrixian song, if I can use the term. The other one was The Lady Loves to Dance, which is one of, I think, about half a dozen songs that Phil worked with. He worked on with a lad called Junior Giscon. And even though they were finished, they've never actually been released. So again, that's just after Thin Lizzy. I think it's November 1983. The Lady Loves to Dance is it's a very 80s kind of pop tune, very commercial. And One Wish is that relates to one of the songs from Phil's post Thin Lizzy career, Grand Slam. It started out as a song called Harlem, and morphed for the most part into One Wish.
Okay.
It's very it's a nice song. It's one of those songs actually that the lyrics go back to 1968, and yet the song was recorded in 1985. So he never let go of any lyrics. He never threw anything away.
Right. Yeah.
And it's quite a nice song.
So listen, Alan, on that we're going to play out on One Wish in a minute, but I want to wish you every success with this book, and indeed your future endeavours as well.
Thanks indeed.
And well done to you on this one. It certainly is a great read, and I would highly recommend that people go out and buy it for the rocker in your life, or like myself, I suppose, if you grew up in the 80s, you would have remembered Thin Lizzy, and it's a great insight to the whole life of Phil Lynott. Alan, thanks very much as well for taking the time to take our call this evening. Very much appreciate that as well. Take care of yourself, Alan, and we'll talk again soon, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so we'll play One Wish. You're listening to Cork City Community Radio on 100.5. This is your call, and this, to my best of my knowledge, is probably the first time that this song has been heard or played on radio.